Glew graduated in 1989. He has taught, lectured and exhibited in the UK, USA and Scandinavia, including at the Royal College of Art, the Architectural Association and Drawing Matter. He was a guest professor at the Danish Royal Academy of Fine Arts and received an Ivy Grade Travel Scholarship to the USA in 1989, and in 2007 was awarded a Statens Kunstfond, the Danish National Arts Award, in recognition of his contribution to architecture and culture in Denmark. A European practice in London, approaching design and teaching as a social art, with a focused sense of visual from a direct observation from within the world, breaking down the separation of boundaries across the scales. Published recently in Domus by Tony Fretton, Practice, What Next? On Seeing and Being. He asked, what is architecture already doing to issues of the present? This lecture focuses in a kind of thesis, a case study of a house and garden, a world of small things. It makes one little and everything. Designed over a discontinuous 10 years, at times seemingly collecting together many ideas as one and the same. It is in part excerpted from a draft publication, Second Thought, almost without words, predominantly visual, using common sense as practical wisdom. I'd like to thank everyone for coming this evening. I was fortunate enough to meet John yesterday evening for the first time, where we bonded over a shared love of cycling. I find John's architecture inherently interesting. A quote from John that I found extremely compelling was, "In my work, I try to give people moments where their thinking stops and their experience begins, somewhere in between apprehension and knowledge. I think of my talk to make good questions, not just simply answering others." Last night we both expressed the love of photography and the focus it can give, seeing things more than when you first looked, things you were unaware of in the blink of an eye. John's photo essay lecture of architect Kay Fisker saw the camera had noticed its stacked, blocky bands of stripped brickwork, its projecting balconies overlooking the street in conversation across the road. For me, it doesn't matter where you draw your inspiration from, only the impact you create. In one of John's early projects, the thought of adding and altering resonated with me, that one should not erase, but simply intensify. It was received by a critic who wrote, "The work that John has made here does not point immediately to its status as architecture or even design. Those elements that might signify authorship in a conventional way are subdued, if not entirely absent." Glew's position seems to be that there is a pleasure and peace attained from the ordinary itself. I was again intrigued by John's aphorism of being without demanding attention to itself. Some part of sight, the mind assuming that there is always empty space somewhere. The pleasure of anticipation is always the sharpest. Likely my favourite case study as a kind of thesis, 51A. There is a lot of attention given to the small scale details, a scheme where almost every element was drawn, redrawn and drawn again. Previously it was quite normal for an architect to design so much. Today it's very unusual, however. It makes one little room everything. I'd like to welcome John Glew.
Thank you very much indeed. It's a touching introduction. I'm going to sit down and speak because I find it easier. Thank you again. This is the view from my room this morning. It's uncanny. After having written quite a lot, I decided this morning I'd actually speak very little and let the images speak for themselves. My voice alongside them in companionship to help them along. This generous invitation to speak here in the School of Architecture has been a gift, an opportunity to listen in again to what the work's been trying to say, how I got there and the things along the way. As part of the short introduction, I'd like to tell you something about me, what I do, a way of being an architect, which is personal, a process of design and thinking about architecture, about how architecture communicates more than architecture itself, about life. I think my work best comes from some things which interest me. There's always something. I feel this, it's a gut reaction. My intention is to try and give a way in to show my thoughts behind the designs, some of the actual thinking behind the activities. It's often quite slow and messy. Alongside designing things and buildings and spaces, I'll talk briefly about teaching and lecturing, exhibiting, writing and speaking, and also about cycling, which I do as often as I can. Like any form of practice, it builds muscle memory, as sketching has done for me. It allows new things in to enter relaxedly, without burdensome thought, effortlessly, intuitively. It's the artistry and grace of the pole vaulter that matters, not my own speed or distance, but poetry in motion. Architecture is not like goal scoring. And as I said to some students today, I think the practice of architecture requires this preparation to begin with, from where it can take off. Repetitive tasks repay hard labor, and it's a discipline required of an architect. And to state the blindingly obvious, here we are in a room with me talking about architecture on its behalf, my words in companionship alongside their images, in addition to what they say themselves. Architecture is different to this. It's physical and affecting, best experienced directly, standing or moving, facing forward, looking up and down, left and right, feet stable on the ground. I'll try to speak only about that which can be said. I write, think, and imagine best about things knowledge doesn't taint, thought that can't have answers to. Sometimes it feels as if thought comes along, knowledge comes along and tries to trip me up. Alongside my own different voices, I'll introduce others, vital commentaries, criticisms and observations. Their impersonality allowed me a way in to locate the work, something as an author I'm too close to. Their opinions matter to me. They bothered about these things, and my life is richer for it. Thank you. By including these, I hope to frame it, to see it in relation to other things. At times, this presentation is like flipping through a book, stopping occasionally, focusing in on things that caught my eye, as if seen high up from a hot air balloon, occasionally looking down through binoculars at details in the surface, passing slowly over the landscape. Small things carefully indexing part of a whole. Within a walled garden, a small landscape. It's a place where I go, where many things have happened. It's a place where I have good thoughts. It's a place I go to when looking up from my desk. This walled garden sits directly outside my living room, which when standing up is just above eye level, sloping slightly forwards towards me, foreshortened almost without a mid-ground. Walking up outside is like entering another room. It encourages a relaxed sense of being as part of a larger, more social scale. Slowly redrawn over the years, adjustments and changes have appeared, some by my own hand, some dropped in by others from above. And he was there a few days ago too. On photography, I think of my looking and photographing as part of my thinking about design and architecture. I can sketch with a camera. Some things seem to have slipped in around the edges, which can become a focus beyond the frame, where other things can emerge from through interpretive and imaginative thought. Here are a few images that spoke to me of feelings I share within my own work, sympathies and beauties, some of which I may well have borrowed. This is down the road in Skibbereen, as you may know. And this is very close to where I lived in Copenhagen, and is an introduction to a photo lecture I gave on Copenhagen and the architect Kai Fisker and others like him. I think I share with it some of the sensibilities in my own work. Over a period of time, about 25 years, my experience of Copenhagen is like that of a very large, intimate, and at times anonymous room-like interior, one designed to heighten the visual experience with a hand-drawn care, one of beautiful Cité-esque spaces and an attention to detail at many scales. Its arrangement often hand-drawn like and full of care, part of a reformed European society, a place where architecture is practiced as a social art. The blue are the lakes, which I think the layout was inspired by Camillo Cito, the Austrian writer whose book City Planning According to Artistic Principles was, I believe, very much in the hands of Danish architects at the time. And an inverted photograph of that space, the Fisker building I'll talk about, is at the top end of the lakes, at the very edge, at the brow of it. And this is it almost 100 years ago, 1929. It's quite an abstract building, and it's one of my favorites there. Somehow I was caught in its gaze as it called out to me. On and off, I pedaled past it for over 20 years, but noticed it more when tasked with preparing the lecture. I began to look more through photography. The cameras notice its stacked, blocky bands of striped brickwork, its projecting balconies overlooking the street, in conversation across the road. Drawing matters. This is teaching, drawing matter. A 5-day international graduate workshop on drawing at Chatwell Farm. looking, thinking, drawing, and trying to learn to forget habitual practice. Conceived of as an opportunity to sit in an intimate setting and look at an extraordinary architectural drawings collection in conversation around a table, alongside sketching around the farm as a direct response, and all outside of the conventional demands of a school's crib. Here we are, I think, discussing a Louis Kahn drawing. And here, perched high up to the right, to the left of the ladder, is Gustav looking at something. I don't know what caught his eye. And here is a drawing I like a lot, Giacomo's. I think much was learned by careful observation, drawn and redrawn with a form of intelligence sensed and felt. Several years later, I was commissioned to design a very small project here. And I used to stay here. This is a dairy building. That's where I used to stay. And I'd walk to and from along this wall. And the site of the project is just there. It's very small. The view back to the site is through this arch, Stevie Taylor's cowsheds. And this is a drawing, imaginary really, just collecting together the things that I remembered. For Domus magazine, I wrote, Shatwell Farm also contains the drawing archive matter, agricultural buildings by Stephen Taylor, a tower by Peter Smithson, and Aldo Caesar's broken column. Whilst providing a shortcut to the sauna, these steps call back to the gazes of those buildings as fragments. I sketched directly here in response to a probing 12-hour conversation, imagining a step somewhere in between a small abstract building and a hand-drawn like block for mounting a horse. They're made from uncut concrete blocks that are found around the farm, but highly studied so as to say different things from each side and reassuringly different underfoot when in motion. This was a model actually made at breakfast, from which the built object doesn't change that much other than with very, very small revisions that I'm sure we all labor over. And these were drawings made by Michael, who very patiently put up with my consistent changes, and I thank him enormously for that. Exhibiting architecture. I think this was the basis from where this talk began. Exhibiting architecture can be difficult to stage. I was invited to show my work in an artist studio which doubles as an exhibition space. I placed my work on tables and pinned it to the wall, all seen in relationship to views outside. I thought it was a good situation, 2 rooms where people could where people could see the work, sit down or read publications, and all in an intimate, well-lit setting. At the opening dinner, as part of the introduction to the exhibition, the guest speaker described what he saw around him. As with artists and photographers, by perception, imagery is personalized. Things are being said which are bigger than the evident first starting point of their work. As it is with space for architects. This acuteness can be seen in their built work, this quality of architecture. Additions and alterations, allowing for continuities between new and old, making way for considerations to adjust typologies for living. I was asked to make a home from a red brick house previously subdivided into apartments, undoing the physical divisions, revealing it to still be alive, an elegant, tall-ceilinged, full of light and refined house. As opposed to changing the plan, I chose to reinforce some of its characteristics as a family house. My design focuses including a new handrail and banister in oak up to the first floor where the money ran out, and it began quickly continued in white painted timber, which rotates at each landing, and to turn what is the outside lavatory into a study cell, which remains external. And the only one structural opening is here, which now turns two rooms into one, the nibs of which conceal exaggerated stainless steel kitchen units behind. In most of the rooms, only small things were introduced, all rhyming with one another. A faint armature of dotted elements, bespoke aluminium and brass lamps, the porcelain door handle designed in close collaboration with the wonderful Danish designer Tore Urup, and off-the-shelf white concave thermostats. A series of brass lamps. A small collection originally designed in response to the introduction of unflattering low voltage lamps. I wanted to design something more yellowy and humane. Comprising a normal incandescent light bulb with a polished aluminium cap from Denmark, reflecting onto a circular polished brass disc. Now there's a small series of prototypes, some more ambitious. Desk lamps and standards. and some small offshoots, useless, shiny abstractions. Here migrated to friends' desks in London and Delft, collecting around them their surroundings. And on a very different scale, Parco di Cilento, an UNESCO World Heritage Site, a report commissioned by the Ministry of the Environment for a brief 28-day excursion, a long-term infrastructure plan for a vast park stretching 240 kilometres by 130, just south of Paestum. And I said, as architects, we bring distinct spatial understandings to these situations, placing things next to other things, seeing the similarity between dissimilar things. The character of this project and its title, Walking Around, Looking At, Thinking About, is about many things, some unseen, and is both a loose descriptive process and an idea in itself. Here are some of the clients. This report of observation and commentaries can be viewed as indicative of life within the park, a series of disconnected events, diverse and extraordinary circumstances of the everyday, remarkable inhabited park, in part abandoned, where people have been neglected, at times clinging on to a dignified existence. I saw my task as to make suggestions as to how an economic viability and a sustained life could be reintroduced alongside new activities, nurturing existing patterns of life and cultural connections beyond its boundaries. Many of these observations became the basis of this photographic travelogue, a report designed in the form of an illustrated document to be read as a basis of design. So this collects together initially areas that could become projects. This is about the organization of the land and small care that's been invested, which is undermined and overlooked. Another one is the development of very, very small scale agriturismo activities, drying tomatoes, a salmon farm, and also the almost guerrilla network of distributing water, which could, of course, be an architectural element, together with comparing abandoned industrial sites with conventional archaeological ones and seeing the flows of the history. And then lastly, which was a surprise, finding out that there's a walking path from Norway through southern Italy. Yes. And it goes right through the park. And yet there's no register of it. So they were potential areas that could be developed. And the second of the Italian jobs, both unbuilt, is the Cava di Santa Lucia, an abandoned limestone quarry, one of 23 between Rome and Naples, a European commission by the Italian government for a large-scale landscape project in southern Italy. The framing of objects and space by careful observation, the naming of parts, ideas my architecture shared with the photography, nurturing a gift of the site without erasing it through design, beginnings, forms and surfaces. Lacking any idea as to how to begin, true, I thought of the site as remembered, how I brought it back to the studio in the form of a small photo archive. It reminded me of my travels and photography in the American landscape. I went out there, saw things at that time in those places. Early propositional ideas emerged from the documentary photography. I had somehow pieced together strategic viewpoints, capturing the site's shape, space, and building's organization its intelligence. It had been propositional prior to any design process, unbeknown to me. I made rough models of the site and observed afterwards what had happened. It had provided me with a way in. Abstracted models of an ensemble of buildings here sat on a flat dais, noticing the intelligence of how they'd been placed, anticipating the excavation around the rim of what now seemed to be a vast crater, foreshortened in space like a still life on a table, and handy plaster cast models of the topography as a whole space. I began to remember small places and named them, the naming of parts. I thought to link them together with a series of paths, short and long, around the rim, to walk, to hike, to sit, places from which this astonishing landscape could be viewed, places to picnic, ride horses, watch a drive-in movie. One small building, like a small house, which could become a gelateria, a place where children might rest and enjoy an ice cream. And I'd like to mention these extraordinary images by Doxiadis. Beautiful drawings documenting the composition and layout of Greek temples. Peripatetic ideas heightening a sense of drama through anticipation. It's at odds with a frontal axial approach, more like figures glanced obliquely in cones of vision, faces seen askew. So this, I don't know how that looks as a drawing. From here it doesn't look so good, but the dotted lines, you can see them, have conical shapes that were understood to be places to see things from, like cones of vision. And design elements were introduced, understanding that this was kind of an entry space and that you would see things along the length of it. So these three engineering structures are foreshortened and seen in this edge, from which a very particular drawing is made, which was exhibited in a palazzo, and it was designed specifically for that site. Excuse me. It was the first attempt at Photoshop, a painting-like render designed for a particular room, Palazzo Reale, where it would be exhibited in relation to some very large-scale, colourful neoclassical oil paintings, describing places that it might too become later part of. And I haven't really worked this through, but it's a drawing showing the comparison between two projects. On the left, obviously, the quarry, and the right, a house, which I'm finally getting to. Of which I think the house collects together, in my eye, all other projects as one, of which I think there is only probably one idea. Changes, homework, improvements, alterations to a house and garden without balconies or verandas. Drawn and made over a discontinuous 9 years, it took many drawings of every corner and every space, vastly disproportionate in amount to its size, which is often the case in projects like this. Almost everything was drawn. Lots of attention was given to small-scale details, some drawn and some redrawn. The large amount of design is disproportionate to its size. The photos have been taken at various times during the project and serve both as documents and some more imaginative, atmospheric and picture-like, perhaps similar to the genre of European painting. And this is a kind of request. I hope you might, when I get to them, be able to go at least halfway and meet them. And that, I think, is important, because I think it's a place from where things might begin to happen. It's the mind's eye. And it's as if these photos might be giving off tiny images of themselves, traveling through your mind, traveling through your eye to your mind's eye, where I think interesting sensations can happen. A personal interpretation full of the imagination, suspending your disbelief, trusting your instinct, entertaining contradictions, and believing them both to be true. Going to places you didn't expect. The mechanical drawings and renderings communicate ideas of design, like speaking pictures, intended as accessible but incomplete. For budgetary reasons, it was agreed not to demolish the house, but to redevelop, not to demolish the house and redevelop the site, but to try to develop a small design on ground it was never intended to. And the blue on that drawing is the site, and it sits almost where the crescent and the bar kiss, but not quite. And the junction between its neighboring house and that roof is 250 millimeters. The accommodation comprises a double bedroom with a bath, a TV room, a laundry room, as well as a complete remodeling of the house. And I tasked myself with designing all of the windows, doors, and other architectural elements, overscale gutters, floors, walls, and furniture, each of which was to be made visible, and the construction as an aesthetic. I tried to encourage the contractor and all tradespeople to be precise and work a little bit on their comfort level, which they rose to. I remember first meeting with the site manager, who immediately commented that he thought this was a serious project because of the way it had been drawn, and almost everything was, apart from the garden, ironically. And this is stating the blindingly obvious, from drawing to building. Like, we as architects don't make buildings, we make representations, which we give to other people to translate. And the working drawing is the vessel through which that's done. The detailed drawing communicates precise intentions about making to others, some of whom I had little control over. So, I'll try and talk. I think this is a good drawing to talk about. The addition to the house is here, the existing house is here, and it sits within an old brick wall, which ends there, terminating on a pier and another pier. A covenant existed to maintain a path 650 millimeters wide between the boundary wall and it. And my idea was to try and make the house more modern, by which I mean spatial as well as room-like, and to give it some formality. So the lobby has a degree of formality. The new door is made to contain that space within which the stair sits. But also when it's open, you can see straight through the house. So it's quite possible to understand a bigger space through these French doors within which the house sits. And the accommodation comprises of a 6 square meter television room and a very tiny laundry room, which I think might not even be 3 square meters. 2 new openings occur in the gable wall. One at entry level, where the door is set back, and 2, the second one at the top of the stair, where the door is flush with the internal wall. And the upstairs accommodation is one large space, trapezoidal, with a bath and a laundry box, the footprint of which almost plans itself, and two windows light that room, one at each end, which also provide light to wash this, what was a gable wall, over which there's a roof light. And elsewhere, things are kind of tidied up and expanded. The bathrooms invested in, and a new kind of railway carriage type shower room is provided there. On the street, the house is, I think, quite miniature. I mean, in relationship to these villas, the eaves goes up to the first floor of the ceiling. But I think the intention was that it should become part of an ensemble, even though it's quite abstract. New windows were designed for the existing house, where the face of the glazing is brought out as flush as it is with the new. So there's some continuity across the old to the new. And the proportioning system is used here and here. This is a large version of that. And this is a picture of it imagined. And it later became real. A new door was provided, which has overscaled elements, the visual decisions that determine the sizes of things, not pragmatics. And a drawing for Sean's first year students, a one-to-one drawing of a lock case, which had to be made to show precisely the dimension away from the end to fit the lock into. This is at one-to-one. And a drawing of the fine zinc junctions, which project 25 millimeters away from the surface of the zinc, and an overscaled gutter and downpipe, and a very large window behind which is a very small room, and these relatively small windows behind which is a relatively large space. There was no money for landscaping, and so there was effectively a hole there. I wouldn't cover it with concrete now, but it was imagined almost like a Japanese garden that you would just look at and would be viewed from the television. This is the ground floor where there's a recess for a TV, a couch, and in the corners of each room are placed wall lights. There's no ceiling lights. The door is placed back from this new opening, which makes a thick threshold in the wall of which you step over. And the room has two identical figures, one blank and one open. And then upstairs, there are two smaller windows which wash light across this wall, over which there's a roof light, which is ostensibly opposite the place that you sleep, where the bed is placed. So sleeping here, you look at this wall and you look up. The bed and the laundry basket sit in a kind of congested space, the thin end of the wedge, as it were, and not by desire, but by result. This trapezoidal space exaggerates the perspective that you have. So this relatively small room can look much larger. And the sills to each of these windows, even though they're quite different, are the same. This sill sits in a thin wall, and this sill sits, it's a tongue twister. This sill sits in a thick wall, which is deliberate architecturally, so that this bay extends out as if to prop up the existing house, which it doesn't. It's as if. And this is a drawing that doesn't reproduce very well on screen, but it's a figure of the end window, which is quite low, which can be looked at when lying in the bath, and sits opposite a window of the same size at the opposite end, almost as if these two windows are figures which hold up a picture, excuse me. Oops. No, sorry, which hold up a picture, apologies, up here. So it's a small architecture. Every aperture was drawn, and this is the one I was talking about, the deep window to the front and the thinner wall with the same sill at the back. And I would never recommend designing windows. They're complicated things. Get a specialist to do them. But my idea was to design everything. And this was to do with an exercise because it wasn't a big project. I thought I'd try and design everything. And ostensibly, the openings are made with members and then packing pieces and linings. Then the glazing is put onto the packing pieces and then closed by, that's a better drawing. So tolerances are taken up here, frames are put into here, linings then follow there, glazing goes onto that, mastic, and then closing here. These drawings are to show the openings and positioning of elements as a composition. The only non-lined framed window is the seat in the roof, where it's cut through almost like a sheet and the ridge is curved. So looking up is dreamlike, intended to be dreamlike. And this is, if you ever get the chance to be published in German magazines, take the opportunity. They redraw everything, of which this is an example. So this is stage one on the right, the extension on the left, and the view through the house, through these doors. And this is the beginning of stage two, which is the garden, which I wrote about in Domus as follows: the making of a miniature landscape. In actually making the garden, I realized how complex they are. Plants are complicated, have various species, each of which their own preferred companionships. Sorry, excuse me. Each with their own preferred companionships, which don't comply with my own ideas as drawn. Nature prevails regardless and seemingly in spite of my drawings. The garden came into being through a combination of observation and labor, the final part of a 9-year discontinuous residential project. I noticed the form of the giant plane trees and the terrace almost kissing the crescent opposite. The sun's path throughout the day from high to low imagining what this intimate space would feel like when seated low down on the sun bench or standing at the kitchen window. The garden, flatter, more room-like, taking on a more abstract sense of space. One's viewpoint changed, redirecting one's gaze opposite towards the raised barge-like planters, which take their clues from the blocky cinnamon-painted windows. Very little drawing was made. This and this being the spatial elements, and then this being the bench. Very little drawings were made, only some sketches of the bench supported on a raft, two piers defining figures on a wall. Some drawings I made directly on the ground, looking at the existing crazy paving. A sort of geography emerged, a coastline bounding a loose field of sandstone gravel made from paving which was left over in part and in removal. I understood how underfoot it might feel, like walking up a sand dune or pebbles at a beach. Here's Michael helping me patiently, probably cursing me, but I am indebted to his patience for helping me draw this in the ground. Okay. I sent a friend some photography of this, and I got this wonderful reply back, which I'd like to read to you. It's very well described, and it's more than I can see. John, what you say about one hand at work is how I perceive it. The authorship is common and present. A thread of connectivity is visible. All the photos from the house, one I consider more emblematic than others. It is a picture from the hall that says a lot about the house and also about the way John Glew depicts it with the help of a camera. It is a picture from the hall, not of the hall. This picture seems to capture an ambience rather than objectively recording the room. There is something unaffected about the photograph from the hall, at the same time as the picture angle, the light and the arrangement of the doors reveal that it is composed. More or less all of the pictures of the house are characterized by the same ambiguity. These pictures have a value in addition to being representations, but while they can stand on their own, they also serve as instructions as to how to interpret architecture. It tells a lot about Glew's approach to the assignment. It has been about rebuilding a mock Georgian house from the 50s. The impression on first glance is the contrast between old and new that characters the exterior, which is lacking on the interior. And he goes on to say, your approach is free, and the arrangement of drawings and text that you propose seems primarily associative. What struck me right now is that there is a continuous flow of material that is somehow characteristic of your way of communicating. I think I understand what you mean by drama. You never show it all in one view. Instead, you present fragment after fragment, and anticipation is built up gradually. Oh, that wasn't very clever, excuse me. That's the image on the left that he's speaking of. And some of the sketches behind that work, which don't necessarily bear resemblance to it, but it's from where things began. And then finally, very quickly, a sketched scheme, a Piccadilly penthouse, commissioned to be hand-drawn and with an iPhone very quickly over a short period. In a situation, to my eye, recalling Hitchcock's dramatic setting for Rear Window, a private, room-like internal space, but outside and intimate. The project is to extend this roof, which includes top up into a penthouse apartment. It's a bit sketchy, as sketch schemes are. Lots of ground was covered without being bogged down by fine detail, presented in a loose, interpretive way. Some of the sketches have an urgency, almost without thought. And it's a good reflection of how they came about, some at speed, as if my hand was the boss. A remarkable situation, a rooftop setting in Piccadilly, in ad hoc London, with very tall, overscaled gables set alongside the paint glazing of winter gardens. The enlargement of this penthouse apartment was imagined as a place of small gatherings mixed with reflective spaces as a research residence. Bound on all sides by tall masonry blocks open to the sky above, its space defined at each end by giant gables standing like flat figures, a place absorbed into the design, emerging alongside the forms of the society which created it. One idea placed a new belvedere stood on an existing brick base with a group of small courtyards like those found in Pompeian villas, set between extended brick gable ends, with an overscaled staircase placed to link all floors from which the distant views of others are occasionally glimpsed from afar, their faces unrecognizable. So the three bold orange verticals are the new gables built up in between which this figure can emerge. And it's anticipated that the roof on the left will be used by the neighbor. So it's anticipating even more development. I said to Sean and Connor last night, my drawings got worse. I did this when I was 19, when I started architecture school. I don't think I'd want to draw like that anymore, but I'm surprised that I could do it. Thank you.